A little blurry there. There, there we go. Okay. How's it going, everyone? Chris here again with another grad school reading. We're in week 9 of archival interventions, and so we're just going to get right into it. I'm going to go ahead and I can do a live transcript. Could do that because it could transcript everything I'm not saying or reading, rather. So we'll start sharing the screen. Let's see here. I think this should be good. All right. So here we are with listening, with Gothenburg's Iron Well engaging the Imperial Archive through Black feminist methodologies and arts-based research by Lena Sawyer and Nani Osei Kofi. Probably not pronouncing that right. I apologize. Okay. Nana, the sound of water. I'll zoom in. The sound of water, the sound of the movement of iron, from mine to scales to ship to sea to iron. The sound of the whip on the backs of those who carried the iron. The sound of water as it flows through the fountain. In tension with the silence of water in the vessel you carry. Water, the source of life. You, the carrier. Lena, your open mouth, your gaze far away, back turned against the water, so alive, frozen, looking out into space. The future, what are you trying to say? You speak to us. A message of your life, how you got here, of your humanity, of those before and those who came after, and who are waiting to be. An edit that Tor Strindberg had not imagined or hoped for. Lena and Nana, let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin at the end. Lena, I was born in 1968 in Princeton, New Jersey, my mother having left Sweden on one of the last America boats from the Gothenburg port. There, working as an au pair in New Jersey, she and my father met in a taxi in Harlem, the story goes. He was part of the small, close-knit African-American community of Princeton, New Jersey, and had just returned from service in the Army. I grew up in the US, did field work in Sweden for my anthropology dissertation in the 1990s, and moved to Sweden more permanently 20 years ago. About the same time, Nana, you moved to the US. I wonder if our paths crossed. I moved to Gothenburg recently and often pass by the statue that is the subject of this piece, as it is a few minutes from my workplace at the Department of Social Work, University of Gothenburg. Seeing it has always done something with me. The naked women's bodies, but in particular the representation of an African woman, is where I have often found myself drawn to stand, look closer and sometimes touch her crouching body alone and often cold. She is made of bronze, her gaze staring out into space and her mouth slightly open. The encounter has always felt heavy, and when I looked into published work about the statue, I was confounded by the silence in terms of critical writing, as well as talk about the statue. And it became clear to me that this is yet another fragment and evidence of the Swedish colonial archive and silence on Swedish coloniality, at the same time vibrating with affect, a reminder, a fragment of loss and the ruptures of diasporic life. Like a few other potent archival fragments I have collected into my own little archive during my time in Sweden. I have used images of the statue in my teaching as a way to create alternative knowledges and to create awareness on the public archive and cultural memory. I ask students to see the archival fragments I share as ghosts of colonialism and ask them, what do they say to you? Do you hear their whisper? What stories do they tell you? Nana, born in Gothenburg in 1969 to a Swedish mother and a Ghanaian father, in 1988, I was selected to participate in a year-long travel experience with the US-founded international educational organization Up With People, an event that was covered by several of Gothenburg's newspapers during the early part of 1989. One of these articles detailing my then forthcoming experience, published in Arbetet, included a very large photograph of me at Jorntorget, the Iron Square, standing in Jorntorgsbrunnen, the Iron Square well. It is emptied of water in the winter months. Next to one of 5 bronze figures of nude women representing the continents of the world. Specifically, I was positioned next to the figure representing Africa, with my right arm embracing her shoulders. Today, I can only speculate about the representational intentions of the photographer and or the journalist who interviewed me. Was it meant to symbolize my connection to the African continent, my upcoming travel experience as a form of conquest, or journeying outside Sweden as an extension of the worldliness of the city of Gothenburg? I will probably never know. For me, growing up, Jorntorget was about the Swedish labor movement, with which I, along with my family, so strongly identified. My most salient place-based memory of Jorntorget is standing in a long line at ABF, Arbetarnas Bildningsforbund Workers' Educational Association, in 1986, to sign a book of condolences following the murder of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. As a young adult, I do not remember the photo shoot or having any specific thoughts about the statue. It was just a part of my everyday, coloniality hidden in plain sight. And it would take several years, decades in fact, living outside Sweden for Jorntorgsbrunnen to take on a new meaning for me. In the same way that much of qualitative inquiry asks that we defamiliarize ourselves with the familiar to see things anew, and to question that which we have thought of as natural, assumed and unquestioned. Years after standing in the fountain to have my picture taken, I would come to see it as if it were for the first time, seeing it through the eyes of whom I had become and what I now knew of the world, of history, of empire, of radicalization and racisms, of capitalisms, of tropes of gender and nation, and of public memory. Today, it has become impossible for me to pass the fountain without experiencing frustration at the ways in which most, if not all, who pass by fail to actually see it, whether it is rushing to catch a tram or a bus, or sitting on the edge of the fountain eating ice cream in the summer, or gathering for a demonstration. There is an absence of impact or significance. In the same way, I experienced this public archive, one of the city's most well-known statues, in my youth. I'm gonna pause it real quick. A 10-foot tall, naked African woman in bronze crouches frozen in space at Jorntorget, a heavily frequented public space in Gothenburg, Sweden. She is part of Tor Steinberg's 1882, 1968, 1927 statue De Fem Varolds Delarna, the 5 continents, or as it is typically referred to today, Jorntorgsbrunnen. She is positioned as one of 5 naked women who occupy the outer circle of the fountain, all of whom are either seated or crouching, looking outward into space, with their backs to each other. These women, representing the world's continents, were sculpted to mark the port city of Gothenburg as a central actor in the global export of iron ore. Jorntorgsbrunnen is a marker of imperial memory in the European Colonial Archive, Wecker 2016. At the same time, over 100 years later, the statue is part of our cityscape. Moving through this space, we heard the statue whisper as she asked us to engage the colonial archive and the ways in which our own past, present, and future intertwine in and with this public archive. And in hearing this whisper, listening carefully, we chose to respond. I like that. The statue talked to them and said, there's more to this statue than you realize. Do some research, look for what's not here. So here's the fountain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 women, as you can see them. This one is Africa, crouched, sitting, all of them courtesy of the author. So yes, very, very much a public space. People right over there. Looks like buses or something like that, buildings. So, okay. The focus of this open space piece is to reflect on our process of seeking a way to understand this archival entity or public space and question its meaning or significance in the present or past and in our own lives. During the 2018 to 2019, we collaboratively engaged in the project of creating affectively based knowledges about this space and statue, which we saw as a trace, a vestige archive of slavery. Hartman 2006, Svetkevich 2012. In our arts-based research piece, which we performed at Denor, a decolonial conference in October 2018, and at G19, a gender studies conference in October 2019, both in Gothenburg, Sweden, we aim to engage the colonial archive through decolonial and Black feminist methodologies. Through this project, we sought to offer a contribution to the long legacy of counter-narratives and shadow archiving, to add to the ongoing edits that have been made and are being made to the public archive, and the dominance they invoke, as well as aim to erase. Importantly, we envision ourselves as joining a community of counter-archivists who are part of critical debates and knowledge-making around the colonial public archive. Recent examples of this include the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, Lavon Bell and Jeanette Eller's I Am Queen Mary 2018 statue in Copenhagen, as well as activism around Confederate statues in the United States. I do know a little bit about this last thing here, Confederate statues. They started popping up after the Civil War because the South was trying to promote the noble lost cause of the Confederacy, saying that it wasn't as bad as people make it out to be. When they completely negate all the slavery and subjugation and everything else, they just sort of say that here's a part of our culture that we're trying to preserve. And it's like, you're trying to perpetuate the idea that white people are better than Black people, and that's not the case. So a lot of people want these statues taken down because it just reminds people of a time when white people thought they were better than Black people, and they're not better than anybody. Nobody's better than anybody. Just gonna put that out there, in my opinion. In our case, methodological approaches have been central to understanding and creating decolonial meanings about the statue. Indeed, in time, our listening led us to refusal, the African woman's body not sitting but crouching, her little toe hanging in space as a sign of potential, frozen but not captured, ready to leap up and forward through space and possibly time. It was a listening that meant engaging our imaginations and maintaining narrative restraint, Hartman 2008, a refusal of the impulse to write in this archive with only the history of anti-Black dehumanization, or as Saidiya Hartman, Ibid, page 7, so beautifully argues, if it is no longer sufficient to expose the scandal, then how might it be possible to generate a different set of descriptions from this archive? In this way, this project was a way to speak with and through the statue and the long history of edits being made in relation to public archives. Finally, it was also to encourage you to listen and to create alternative visions and stories of our shared public space and ultimately also our future. Lena, as we started this work, I was deeply inspired by Tina Camp's 2012-2017 work on listening, because it suggested a way to do research from an embodied place that is anchored both in the material and political realities of anti-Blackness and Black living. This is a perspective that theorizes the continuity of slavery rather than as a break from the past with the present, where slavery's dehumanization continues to shape our lives as Black peoples. Hartman 2008, Sharp 2016, Hable 2018. Camp's concept of listening is in this context a love letter of sorts, written to us, researchers of and in the African diaspora, an offering of an incredibly beautiful and powerful methodology of refusal that lies in the tradition of Black feminism. She offers a decolonial feminist methodology, what she calls a grammar for engaging and challenging traditional social science methods and ways of knowing, which have prioritized the ocular and contributed to the objectification of Black life and living. Instead, she asks us to notice how we encounter these colonial archives and what they say, speak, and whisper through our engagement with them. This is a methodology that is futuristic, imaginative, and imperative, an envisioning of the future we want to see and live in the now, Camp 2017, page 17, through our recognition of the historically dismissed archives of Black life. Listening necessarily destabilizes linear traditional ways of knowing and their dichotomies. where quiet does not mean silence, and where images, events, and Black life are re-engaged and importantly repositioned. That last thing was really, really good, in my opinion. Just going to put that out there. I'm going to read that one more time. I'm even going to highlight it. Listening necessarily destabilizes linear, traditional ways of knowing and their dichotomies, where quiet does not mean silence, and where images, events, and Black life are re-engaged and importantly repositioned. I think that is beautiful. I'm actually going to pause it here and type up a reflection. All right, I am back. Took quite the break, but I am here again. I did a pretty lengthy reflection. I won't bring it up here, but I'll just go ahead and keep reading. Such methodological inspirations invited us to also understand our process as an affective assemblage that necessarily included ourselves and each other as also shaped and negotiating the legacy of slavery in our lives. At the time of our collaboration, the 2018 Swedish parliamentary election was an affective backdrop to our work, and the nationalist and racist Swedish Democratic Party held a rally near the statue, and we attended in counter-protest. During our arts-based performance, I wore my grandmother's wool sweater as a way to bring her with me into the room and to give testimony to her shaping my own life and that of my father. Sawyer, 2008. Nana, you brought the pouring of libations into our performance, the life, sound, and scene of us both pouring water together with moving images of the ocean projected on the screens behind us. We intuitively began filming moving images of the water, the sea in the Gothenburg archipelago, and the shores of Cape Coast, Ghana. As Christina Sharp 2016 discusses, water is an archive of slavery's violence, the intermixing of death with material. Sharp's powerful images of the wake as the movement of water left after ships pass as an archive of the ongoing dehumanization and social death of Black people guided us in our engagement with water. Like Camp's call for the urgency of a methodology of listening, we also heard in Sharp's IBID, page 13, wake work, the call for methodological disobedience, and in particular, that Black scholars become undisciplined. For me, I strongly identified our process with previous experiences I have had with arts-based research, and what I have come to think of as a set of refusals. I have written elsewhere, Osei Kofi, 2013, about the freedom and joy I experienced in coming to understand that there are spaces, while small, within the academy, where multiple ways of coming to know outside of the narrow confines of research described as either quantitative or qualitative can come to life. Work that refuses hegemonic notions of the only way of coming to know as a linear, objective, and disengaged process. I see our project as a form of artography. Springay, Irwin, and Kine, 2005, which engages with art, research, and teaching through the notions of theoria, knowing, praxis, doing, and poesis, making, Irwin, 2004, and which takes up the late Mary Hanley's 2011 notion of arts-based research as counter-narrative. As noted earlier, our work was never simply about a single representation of the Swedish colonial archive, but rather was part of a larger conversation that is ongoing in many parts of the world today, and that concerns the ways in which public art like Brunnen illustrates how power determines the history we choose to remember in public spaces. Foner, 2017. That is to say, we take up Hanley's notion of both meaning, making, and commitments to social change. As we made meaning through a process that refused methodological conventions, we walked together, experiencing Brunnen in silence. We wrote together, sharing our texts with each other, and then writing some more. We listened repeatedly to the sound of water as we sought meaning. Yet another refusal, a refusal of contemporary demands of the Academy for Speedy Scholarship, Hartman and Darab, 2012, page 53. We turned, I would argue, towards the notion of slow scholarship, through a process where we honored the role of contemplation and time in creation. Finally, I want to suggest that our collaboration and shared multimodal knowledge construction across different ways of knowing represent a refusal of the constructed borders, hierarchies, and mainstream assumptions of disciplines, and the notion of discipline itself. Discipline is regulating. Discipline is regulating. While we both read Comp's 2017 Listening to Images as a way of preparing for our joint work and approached the project from shared commitments to Black feminist and decolonial thought, I was struck by the ways in which our separate and overlapping reading practices brought us together in ways that revealed parallel ways of understanding, a process that speaks to the silenced nature of the academy and how different academic languages and epistemologies discipline and easily foster rifts and separations rather than challenging the logic of mastery, Singh 2017. Addressing anti-colonial work specifically in Unthinking Mastery, Julietta Singh, Ibid, page 2, 6 pages, or page PP 2 and 6 and 7, describes her work as a summons to post-colonial studies and its interlocutors to attend to the persistence of mastery at the foundations of the field, and goes on to argue that no matter how it is applied, the logic of mastery is bound to relations founded on and through domination. And I want to think that in some small way, our work as a whole pushed against this insidious logic of mastery. There's some acknowledgements, biographies of the authors, and references. The one with Singh caught my attention because I do have another book by Julietta Singh. Yeah, this book's by Julietta Singh, except it is not the same title. It's called No Archive Will Restore You. Author's same name. Where actually this book is the one I'm reading or going to read for this same class, this archive class. Looks like it was published in 2018, first published in 2018. So No Archive Will Restore You. So it looks like this book came out after. Did I just say 2018? I think I did. In 2018. So that book referenced in this article came out the year before the book that I'm going to read. So that is all for this reading. I plan on doing another one. So I'm going to stop this one here. Say thank you for those of you who listened to it, watched it, related to it, what might have you. So thank you. I hope you had a lovely day.